Nice girls don't fight. They don't confront. In fact, they kind of look the other way. Nice girls do their darndest to avoid those really messy everyday situations in relationships, in ministry, in leadership, in life. In fact, when nice girls do speak their mind, they're usually not thought of as such nice girls. Huh. Really? I think the reality is that those of us who know God, who are called into a relationship with Him, who want to live our lives according to His Word, we find ourselves in difficult situations regularly, in everyday moments. And as such, we are called to find our voice and to have those hard-to-have conversations in such a way that we can resolve conflicts in a healthy manner. Well, just like when we need to tell a family member we're concerned about an addictive pattern that's forming. Or maybe when we need to ask for time off from work in order to care for someone that's precious to us. Or when we need to negotiate a business deal that's gone sour. Or when we need to approach a man in a great position of power because we need to warn him that the direction that he's headed in is dangerous and that he's not going in the way we think God would want him to go. In those moments, we can pull into a woman of the Old Testament named Abigail. In 1 Samuel 25, Abigail is a nice girl who found her voice and who found a way to have those hard-to-have conversations in such a way that conflicts were resolved. As Abigail shares her story in 1 Samuel 25, we find principles for our lives. Let's first get introduced to the characters in this story in 1 Samuel 25. First off, there is Abigail. Abigail's name means like her father is rejoicing, actually. She described herself as a handmaiden of God, and as such, in later centuries, many people named their daughters Abigail in her memory. Now, Abigail was married to kind of the opposite, where she was beautiful and she was intelligent, we're told in verse 3. Her husband, Nabal, was anything but. In fact, he's described as surly and mean in all his doings. In the first couple of verses of this chapter, we're actually told that he was very, very wealthy. And that word wealthy really meant heavy. He was weighed down with all of his wealth. In contrast to Abigail again, the word Nabal actually means fool, folly. Nabal was a fool. In fact, when you go deeper into the Hebrew meaning of that word, you find out that he was actually a man who was morally perverse. To be honest, to be just clear, he was a lout. Nabal was a jerk. He just didn't have appropriate boundaries. He was abusive. And then there was David, the future king of Israel, who had been anointed but had not yet been crowned as king. And this story happens during the season when David is running and hiding from his predecessor Saul, who still won't acknowledge that David is God's chosen. And David is hiding out in the wilderness in the desert of Maon and looking for ways to support himself. The conflict brews up in about verse 5 on through 13 in this chapter. Let's turn our attention there and see what happens. David sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name and say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and to your household, and good health to all that is yours.' Now I hear that it's sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them. And the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they'll tell you, therefore, be favorable toward my young men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them." And when David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name, and they waited. Well, Nabal didn't respond so great. In verse 10, he answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and my water and the meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" David's men turned around and went back, and when they arrived, they reported every word. In verse 13, David said to his men, "Put on your swords." And so they put on their swords, and David put on his. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. Yikes, David was fighting mad. Now, conflict was brewing up on three separate issues. First, there was the whole issue of the employer-employee with Nabal and David. And then there's the issue between husband and wife, Abigail and Nabal, because Abigail hears about this and she's invited in to the conflict. But a bigger conflict was brewing between God and his people, specifically between God and his anointed David, and David, the anointed, and his God. He was tempted to do a very bad thing. This is a life or death situation. And Abigail finds her voice and steps into this conversation. When the servant comes, he says, "Can you please do something?" In fact, what he says specifically in verse 17, "Would you think it over," he says to Abigail, "and see what you can do?" Abigail responds with four basic principles. And in our conflicts and our hard-to-have conversations, we may pull from all four of these principles, but you may just tick off one in a given situation that screams into your heart, this is where you need to find your voice. This is where you need to be involved. So think through that as I share these four principles. First off is the word cogitate. Isn't that a great word, cogitate? It means to think deeply or seriously about something. Well, Abigail decided to cogitate. In verse 17, when her servant comes, or Nabal's servant comes, he says, "Would you think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over your master and his whole household?" Well, Abigail did. She decided to cogitate. She thought about it. She put a plan together. In fact, the very next verse 18 says, she decided not to talk to her husband. She decided to keep it to herself. And what did she do? She assembled a peace offering. The gift of provisions that David had actually asked for, she puts together. Actually, everything from 2 skins of wine and 200 loaves of bread, 5 dressed sheep, seahs of roasted grain. Wow, cakes of raisins, tons. Stuffed them onto donkeys and sent them on ahead. She then followed. Abigail also cogitates about her words. You can tell because then when she has the interaction and the conversation with David, her words are carefully chosen. She doesn't just burst into activity. She thinks before she acts. Cogitate. Secondly, Abigail decides to participate. Now, this is a tough one for us. Oftentimes we think, couldn't someone else please have this conversation, resolve this mess? Somebody who's smarter or has more authority or more experience in this situation. Abigail knew that there are moments when the responsibility falls to us uniquely. Even in her situation, I wonder how she did it. Wouldn't it have been tempting to think, wow, he's going to get his just due. Here's Nabal, whose name means folly, who is a jerk. Couldn't it have been just wonderful to let him get what was due? I mean, after all, it wasn't her responsibility, it was his error. If she had just let David and his 400 men overtake and take her husband out, she would have been freed. I have to admit, I would have been kind of tempted. Abigail decides to participate, though. She gets involved. She sends all of these provisions on ahead, and then she herself goes and humbles herself and moves into that third principle, negotiate. And negotiate, and we're going to pick it up in about, verse 20. As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there came David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. She gets there, and David is so mad, and she makes sure she gets off of her donkey and humbles herself down before David. About 6 times in the space of these few verses, she calls him, my Lord, my master, and I am your servant. She says, I'm going to take complete responsibility for this situation. To negotiate is to bargain to a natural end of a conflict. Even though it wasn't her fault and she wasn't even present when the servants came, Abigail gets down and rights the wrong. She negotiates a good resolve, a good resolution to this situation. Then, after she negotiates, Abigail decides to advocate. I love that she did this. It's broadly courageous. To advocate really means to pull out the best and to stand it forward. Abigail advocates for David, and she also advocates for herself. First, she advocates for David by reminding him who he is and whose He is. He is the future king of Israel, the anointed one. And she reminds him of that, saying, you don't want to have murder on your conscience as you take over your duties. She then says to him, I'm going to pray that your life will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord in verse 29. She calls him up and surrounds him with the power that is his, reminding him of what he has to take advantage of what he has at his fingertips. And then she advocates for herself. We forget about this in finding our voice as women who belong to God. Sometimes in having these hard-to-have conversations, we need to advocate for ourselves. Abigail did this several times. She did it first off in verse 19 when she decided not to tell her husband that she was going to have this conflict resolution chat. And then she does it in verse 31 where she says, would you please remember me? Remember your servant when this is over. And then she does it in verse 36 where she returns home and finds Nabal drunk, having a party, and she decides, I'm not going to tell him what's happened right now. She waits till daybreak to tell him. Abigail cogitates. Abigail participates. Abigail negotiates. And Abigail advocates. She finds her voice as a woman in the Old Testament, an example to us of how to find our voices. And she has those hard-to-have conversations, working to resolve conflicts and the very messy, messy relationships of life.
I was born to an alcoholic mother, alcoholic father. My dad drank all the time. My mom did drugs when she was pregnant with me. When I was 3 years old, my parents split up. I lived with my mom. She met a man, fell in love, and that man decided that he was gonna violate me in any way that he could. I was raped, I was molested, and then shortly after, my mom died. At that point, I moved in with my dad. He was still a very strong alcoholic. He drank every night, and it got to the point where he beat me a lot. I had lost all faith in God. I had nothing to look forward to, and I was very depressed. I cut a lot. I thought about dying. I was at school when everything changed. Everything in my life changed. I was running through the halls, and I tripped down a flight of stairs, and to this day, I still believe that an angel pushed me down the stairs. I met this person who came to my rescue as my trainer. You know, I sprained my ankle, and she came to my rescue, and for some reason, something told me that you can trust this woman, you can talk to her. She became my mentor. Shortly after that, life with my dad got really hard, and I attempted suicide. Brindy and Brandon, this family that I met, she had told me that her and her husband had spoke, and that if it was okay with my dad, they were gonna take me in. My dad is a very hard man to talk to. I was scared that he was gonna yell at me. I was scared that he was gonna hit me. I had no idea what I was gonna say. I had no idea. All I knew was that deep down inside, if I would have stayed with my dad, I would have died. And I remember before talking to my dad, sitting in my room and praying and saying, I know I don't talk to you a lot, God. I've lost a lot of faith in you, but I'm asking you to do this one thing for me, and I'm asking you to answer this one prayer that I have, and that's to let me go, to let me have this family, to let me be happy. I mean, I had no idea what I was gonna say. I just hoped that he would give me the words. And we fought and we argued, and I just remember just throwing it at him, you know, that I was gonna die if I stayed with him. And I think at that point he realized that that he had to let go. And it worked out, and I'm here. I'm alive, and I'm happy. And I thank God every day. God is with you. Even when you turn your back on him, he's there. And he's always by your side. And if you go to him in that moment of need, he'll be there. and He'll answer your prayers.
So I had a meeting downtown. I wasn't familiar with the area, and I couldn't find a parking place, but I looked across the street from the building I was going into, and I saw a pretty good parking lot, and so I parked and went in. A few hours later, I emerged, and I found there was a car parked behind my car in this huge parking lot that was now completely filled up. I couldn't exit. I couldn't back up. I was blocked. So I looked around and I figured out, oh, I guess this parking lot belongs to this building. I went in and I talked to the receptionist and I said, gee, somebody's blocking my car. I can't get out. Can somebody move their car? And she looked at me and went, oh, no, you didn't. And I'm like, what? She goes, did you park in Mr. Johnson's place? And I went, who's Mr. Johnson? Evidently, I had parked in his place. And she said, oh, no, you're going to have to talk to him. He's down the hall. And I looked down this scary, long, dark hall. And I said, okay, would you ask him if he would see me now? She buzzed him, and he said, well, she'll have to wait. I'm busy. It'll be about 20 minutes. And I looked at my watch, and I thought, gee, okay. And I sat down, and I waited. And finally, I was ushered into Mr. Johnson's office, where he yelled at me for parking in his parking place. I really didn't know, I told him. I didn't know. I'd never been to this place before. I'm sorry. He said, well, it's your tough luck. You're going to have to just wait until I'm ready to leave, which will be several hours when I go to court. Oh, great, he's a lawyer, I think. But you're going to have to wait. I couldn't believe it. But I left his office just like a good little girl and sat down and waited. And as I looked at my watch and I thought, this is ridiculous. I have apologized. I don't know what else to do. Why is he keeping me here? So I asked his receptionist, please ask if I could talk to him again. She buzzed him again, and another 30 minutes later, he ushered me back in, and I stood before his desk like a tiny little girl talking to the principal with his big old hairy eyebrows staring at me. He said, what do you want? And I said, no, Mr. Johnson, the question is, what do you want? I've apologized. I am so sorry that I parked in your parking place. I promise I'll never do it again. Now I'm familiar with the area. And he looked at me with disdain and he said, well, sorry, you can still wait. And I thought to myself, no, that isn't right. And I dug down inside myself and I thought, where is my voice in this? Where do I get to speak up and say what I need here? And I remembered, oh, whose I am and who I am. I belong to God, and I am one of His children, and I'm connected to Him. And I spoke up and I said, Mr. Johnson, I have apologized. There's nothing more you can get from me. Now, I'm going to ask you in the next 10 minutes to either move your car or I'm going to be forced to call the police and tell them that you are holding me here in your office against my will. He looked up at me and said, bingo, girl. And he went and moved his car. And I thought to myself, that was it. There are times like Abigail when we maybe shake in our souls. I was shaking clear through to my bones. And there are times when we're forced to decide, will we find our voice? Will we speak it up? Will we be the nice girl who finds her voice and advocates in a given situation to have that hard-to-have conversation the way Abigail did?